A racist employee mocks a black customer, is shocked when she finds out he owns the store. Ava Reynolds meticulously folded the silk scarves on the display counter, her fingers moving with precision, though her mind was elsewhere. The afternoon had been busy, filled with the usual well-dressed clientele who knew exactly what they wanted and, more importantly, how to pay for it. Ava liked days like these, when she could look around and feel superior, knowing she was in control of the store floor. After all, she had been working here for years. It was her domain, her kingdom. And in her kingdom, she decided who belonged and who didn't. The chime of the front door rang, slicing through her thoughts. Instinctively, her head lifted from the scarves, her sharp blue eyes locking onto the man who had just entered. She immediately assessed him. Black, tall, dressed in worn jeans and a plain gray t-shirt that had seen better days. His sneakers were clean but cheap, and his body language, though calm, carried an air of self-assurance that Ava found irritating. He didn't belong here. Ava sighed softly, feeling a familiar ripple of irritation run through her. There was always one. Some guy who wandered into the store, eyes wide, thinking he could afford something, or worse, thinking he could look around as if he actually belonged here. She hated that. The store wasn't for people like him. It was for those who knew how to carry themselves, who respected the luxury that hung from every shelf and rack. It was for people like her. The man stepped further into the store, his eyes wandering over the displays of high-end watches and designer handbags. Ava didn't bother to hide her disdain as she watched him, her lips pressing together in a tight, judgmental line. He paused in front of a case of luxury watches, his expression calm, considering, as if he might actually make a purchase. She almost scoffed at the idea. Folding the last scarf with a crisp edge, Ava straightened up, tugging at the hem of her perfectly tailored blazer. She wasn't about to waste her time on this man. Not when there were regulars to look after, people who would actually buy something. This guy would wander around for a few minutes, ask some dumb questions, and leave once he saw the price tags. But the man didn't wander. Instead, he approached the counter where Ava stood, his eyes now fixed on the sleek silver watch displayed behind the glass. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but steady. "Could I see that watch?" Ava's eyes flicked from his face to the watch and back again. She hesitated for a second, her irritation flaring at the audacity of his request. Did he seriously think he could afford something like that? The watch was one of their newest models, retailing at more than most people made in a month. And yet, here he was, standing in front of her with an unbothered expression, acting like he belonged in a place like this. Her lips curled into a practiced smile, but there was no warmth behind it. "Are you sure you can afford that?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. The words came out smooth, as if she were making polite conversation, but the underlying message was clear. You don't belong here. She didn't care if he picked up on it. In fact, she hoped he did. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Emma, one of the younger associates, glance up from the register. Ava could feel her co-worker's discomfort, but it didn't matter. Emma wouldn't say anything. Ava had been here long enough to know how to handle people like this man, and Emma knew better than to interfere. The man's expression didn't change. He didn't react the way Ava had expected him to. There was no flinch of embarrassment, no hasty retreat. Instead, he remained calm, meeting her eyes with a steady gaze that unsettled her, though she would never admit it. He was quiet for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. "I'd still like to see the watch," he said, his voice composed, unbothered. Ava's fingers itched toward the key she kept at her waist for the display case, but she didn't reach for it. She had no intention of letting him handle the watch, especially not after his nonchalant response. She wasn't about to waste time on someone who clearly didn't have the means to make a purchase. Instead, she gave him a curt nod, gesturing toward the back office. "Henry's in the office," she said, her tone clipped. "If you want to speak with the manager, he's back there." A flicker of satisfaction passed through her. That should shut him down. Henry wouldn't care. Ava had been in the store for years, and she knew how things worked. Henry trusted her judgment, and if a customer like this wanted to make a fuss, it wouldn't amount to anything. She felt a small surge of power as she waved the man off, assuming that the situation was now under control. The man didn't argue. He nodded once, his expression still unreadable, and turned toward the back office. As he walked away, Ava watched him, a tight smirk pulling at her lips. She dealt with plenty of people like him before, people who didn't belong, who thought they could waltz in and act like they were part of the world she lived in. But as the man disappeared from view, the smirk faded, replaced by a slight frown. Something about his calm demeanor unsettled her. He hadn't reacted at all the way she'd expected. Usually by now, someone would have backed down or gotten defensive. But not him. He hadn't flinched, hadn't shown any sign of embarrassment or anger. It was as if her words had bounced right off him. She shook her head, brushing the unease away. It didn't matter. He'd be out of the store soon enough, and she could get back to more important things. Like the evaluations coming up, Ava was certain that she was in line for a promotion. Years of loyalty, handling difficult customers, knowing the clientele inside and out. It was her time. Henry knew that. He appreciated how she handled the floor, how she kept things in order. Still, as she turned back to her display, folding another scarf with mechanical precision, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slightly off. Maybe it was the way the man had looked at her, so calm and composed, like he knew something she didn't. The unease gnawed at her, but she pushed it aside, her fingers tightening on the silk scarf as she refolded it for the third time. People like him didn't buy things here, she reminded herself. They never did. Minutes passed, and Ava found herself glancing toward the back of the store where the man had gone to speak with Henry. The unease she had felt earlier hadn't dissipated, and now it was starting to bother her in a way that made her jaw clench. She shouldn't be feeling this way. She had dealt with customers like him for years. She knew what she was doing, so why did it feel different this time? The soft murmur of voices drifted out from the office, though Ava couldn't make out the words. She was about to brush it off and focus on restocking when Henry stepped out of the back, his expression serious. And behind him the man followed, his face still unreadable. Ava's stomach tightened. Henry crossed the store toward her, and as he did, the man's calm demeanor suddenly made sense. He wasn't a random nobody. He wasn't here to make a scene or ask pointless questions. No, he had been waiting for this moment, and now that he was standing in front of her again, she could see it clearly. Henry came to a stop in front of the counter, and Ava felt her heart thud once hard in her chest. The unease she had been trying to ignore now spread like ice through her veins. "Ava," Henry began, his tone formal, "this is Mr. Coleman. He's the new owner of the store." Ava blinked. The words didn't register at first. New owner? No, that couldn't be right. She had been here for years, had seen the store go through management changes, but she had always been told about them in advance. How could this man who she had dismissed so easily, be the new owner? Her mouth went dry, her pulse hammering in her ears. The smirk that had been so easy to wear earlier was gone, replaced by a tightness in her throat that made it hard to breathe. Mr. Coleman nodded once, his gaze steady. "I've been coming in for the past few weeks to observe how things run," he said, his voice as calm as ever. "I wanted to see how the staff interacted with customers, especially customers they didn't recognize." Ava felt a rush of cold sweat prickling at her temples. Ava's entire body stiffened at Mr. Coleman's words. New owner? She replayed his statement in her mind, trying to make sense of it, but it was like the world had tilted off its axis. This couldn't be right. Her eyes darted to Henry, searching for some kind of confirmation that this was all some kind of misunderstanding, a terrible joke. But Henry's face was impassive, solemn. There was no joke. Her mind raced, trying to connect the dots, but nothing made sense. The man standing in front of her, the same man she had just mocked and dismissed like he was a nobody, was now being introduced as the person who owned the very store she had worked at for over a decade. The cold realization slowly crept up her spine. She had insulted him, belittled him, and now he was in a position to do whatever he wanted with her future. "I've been here several times over the past few weeks," Mr. Coleman continued, his tone even and calm, as though he hadn't just dropped a bombshell on her. "I like to see how things are going before I make any decisions about a store I'm taking over." Ava's thoughts spun wildly. He'd been here before. Had she seen him and not realized? She scrambled to remember if there had been any other encounters, any other moments where she might have crossed paths with him. But her memory came up blank. She had probably dismissed him as just another customer, another person who didn't belong. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. I wasn't aware," Ava managed to say, her voice tighter than she intended. I made sure to keep things quiet, Mr. Coleman replied, not giving her any room to recover. I wanted to observe the day-to-day interactions. It tells you a lot about how a store is run and how employees handle customers. His words hung heavy in the air, each one a clear indictment of her behavior. Ava could feel the cold sweat building at the base of her neck, and she had to resist the urge to wipe her palms on her pants. This wasn't just some casual customer complaint. This was the owner of the store, the person who now controlled her livelihood, and he had been watching her. I see, Ava said, though she didn't. Not really. She was still reeling, her mind grasping for some way to salvage this situation. This is bad, really bad. Desperation clawed at Ava's chest, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel in control of her surroundings. Normally, she was the one dictating the interactions, guiding the conversation with her tone, her body language. But now, it was slipping. She could feel it, and she couldn't afford to lose control. She forced a smile, one that felt brittle, like it might crack at any moment. "Mr. Coleman," she began, her voice carefully measured, "I apologize if there was any misunderstanding earlier. I didn't realize you were—" She trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence without digging herself deeper into the hole. "That you were evaluating the store." Mr. Coleman didn't react to her apology. He simply watched her, calm, unbothered, which only made Ava's stomach tighten. His silence was worse than any direct reprimand. It made her feel small, like she was on trial without knowing the charges against her. "I always try to keep things running smoothly," Ava continued, stumbling over her words. "You know, keeping the store professional, making sure the right customers get the attention they need." She winced inwardly at how it sounded, realizing too late the implications of what she was saying. Mr. Coleman's expression remained neutral, but she could see the flicker of understanding in his eyes. He knew exactly what she meant by right customers, and that flicker made Ava's blood run cold. "I understand," Mr. Coleman finally said, his voice still maddeningly composed. "But the thing is, Ava, I wasn't interested in how you treated the right customers. I was more interested in how you treated the others, the ones you thought weren't worth your time." The blow landed squarely in her gut, and Ava's breath caught in her throat. She felt exposed, laid bare in a way that left her scrambling for any kind of defense. "That's not what I meant," she said quickly, her voice rising slightly in pitch. "I treat all customers equally. She trailed off again, realizing that anything she said now would only dig the hole deeper. Mr. Coleman raised an eyebrow slightly, a subtle gesture that sent Ava's mind spinning. "He's not buying this." "Really?" he asked, his voice sharp now, cutting through the tension. "Because from what I've seen, that doesn't seem to be the case. You've been here for a while, haven't you, Ava? You must know how this place works. You know how to make judgments about people the second they walk in, don't you?" Ava felt a chill run down her spine. He wasn't asking for clarification. He was making a point. And she didn't have an answer that wouldn't incriminate her further. "I just want to make sure we maintain the right image for the store," she said, her voice small now, fragile. She could feel her control slipping entirely. For the first time since Mr. Coleman's revelation, Ava turned to Henry, searching for some kind of support. Henry had been the manager for as long as she'd worked at the store. Surely he would step in, say something to smooth things over. He knew her, knew how hard she worked, how much she had done for the store over the years. But when she met his eyes, there was nothing there. No sympathy, no support, just a blank professional mask. Henry wasn't going to help her. He wasn't going to back her up. In fact, Ava realized with a sinking feeling, he was already on Mr. Coleman's side. Henry cleared his throat, the sound breaking the silence like a judge's gavel. "Mr. Coleman has been reviewing the store for the last few weeks," he said, his voice flat, neutral. "It's part of the new ownership process." Ava's heart sank. New ownership process. The words felt like a death knell. She had been so confident, so sure of her place in the store, and now it felt like everything was shifting beneath her feet. She opened her mouth to protest, to say something that would restore her footing. But the words wouldn't come. All she could do was stand there, feeling the weight of her own mistakes pressing down on her, while Henry silently watched, offering no lifeline. Mr. Coleman didn't say anything for a moment, letting the silence stretch out between them. Ava could feel every second of it. her stomach twisting with the growing realization that there was no way out of this. She had misjudged the entire situation, and now there was nothing she could do to fix it. Finally, Mr. Coleman spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Ava, I think it's time we have a serious conversation about the future of this store and about your role in it." The words hit her like a slap, and Ava's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had worked so hard for so many years, and now this man she had dismissed so easily, was standing there deciding her fate. It was unbearable, and yet there was nothing she could do. "I understand," Ava said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. But deep down she knew that she didn't understand at all. She didn't understand how this had happened, how she had ended up here, standing on the edge of losing everything she had worked for. And as Mr. Coleman and Henry exchanged a brief look, one that excluded her completely, she knew that whatever conversation they were about to have, it wouldn't end in her favor. Ava stood frozen behind the display counter, her mind a blur of confusion and growing panic. Mr. Coleman's words still echoed in her head. "A serious conversation about the future of this store, and about your role in it?" The weight of his statement pressed down on her like a heavy stone in her chest. She couldn't wrap her head around it. How had things escalated so quickly? One moment, she was running the floor like always, feeling in control of her territory. And now she was teetering on the edge of disaster. Worse still, Mr. Coleman was calm, composed, not showing a hint of the anger or frustration that might have made the situation easier to handle. His calmness was unnerving. It made her feel like she was already sentenced, her fate sealed before she even had a chance to defend herself. Ava's stomach churned. The man she had belittled minutes ago now held her career in his hands, and, by the look in his eyes, he wasn't about to let her off the hook. She glanced again at Henry, who stood silently to the side, his arms crossed, his face a mask of neutrality. No help there. It was clear that Henry wasn't going to vouch for her, wasn't going to explain to Mr. Coleman that she had been doing her job, keeping the standards of the store in line with what the customers expected. No, Henry wasn't going to fight for her. In fact, she suspected now that Henry had probably known about Mr. Coleman's secret visits all along. He had probably watched her interactions with customers, maybe even reported them back to the new owner. Ava swallowed hard as the realization settled in. She was completely alone in this. The store felt too quiet. The usual hum of customers chatting or browsing was absent. The tension between the three of them, the new owner, the silent manager, and Ava herself, seemed to stretch out, suffocating the space around her. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand there and let this happen. "I want to make things right," Ava said, her voice firmer than before, though inside she felt anything but confident. "If there's been a misunderstanding, I'll fix it. I can adjust my approach." The words tumbled out before she could stop herself. She was scrambling now, grasping at anything to hold on to what little control she had left. "I've been here a long time, and I care about this store." Mr. Coleman looked at her, his expression still infuriatingly neutral. "It's not about adjusting your approach, Ava. It's about understanding why your approach was wrong in the first place." His words stung, not just because of the truth behind them, but because of how calmly he delivered them. There was no anger, no personal vendetta in his voice. He was simply stating a fact that left Ava with nowhere to go. Ava felt like the walls were closing in. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had worked so hard, putting in long hours, taking extra shifts, dealing with difficult customers. She knew the store inside and out, knew what kind of people walked in and what they wanted. How could Mr. Coleman not see that she was just doing her job? I've always treated customers with the respect they deserve," Ava said, her voice faltering slightly. "I know what kind of experience they expect when they come here." Mr. Coleman raised an eyebrow, a subtle challenge. "Do you?" "Yes," Ava insisted, her voice rising despite herself. "I've worked here for years. I know what the customers want. I know how to handle them." She realized too late that her tone was shifting into defensiveness, and she forced herself to stop, taking a deep breath. "I see," Mr. Coleman said softly, but the calmness in his voice only made her feel more on edge. His eyes were sharp, studying her like he was assessing a problem he had already solved. "You see, Ava," he continued, "this isn't about experience. This is about judgment. What I've been seeing over the last few weeks is a pattern, One that shows you make judgments about people before they even have a chance to show you who they are. That's not the kind of environment I want in this store. Ava's stomach clenched tighter. A pattern? Her mind raced, trying to think back over the last few weeks. Had she done anything that could be considered part of a pattern? Yes, she made judgments. That was part of the job. She had to assess customers as soon as they walked in, determine who needed help and who was just browsing, who could afford what and who couldn't. That was retail. That was survival. She opened her mouth to defend herself again, but Mr. Coleman held up a hand, stopping her. "I'm not interested in excuses," he said, his tone firm but still calm. "I've seen enough to know that this store needs to change, and that means the way we treat people needs to change." Ava's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about today, about the incident with him. This was about her entire approach. Everything she thought she knew about running the floor, about handling customers, it was all under scrutiny now. And the worst part was, she didn't know how to fix it. She had been doing this for so long, handling customers in exactly the same way, and no one had ever questioned her methods before. Until now. As Ava stood there, grappling with the weight of Mr. Coleman's words, the sounds of the store finally began to trickle back in. A door to the storeroom at the back creaked slightly as it was pushed open, the soft rustling of bags being moved around inside. A few customers walked in from the front, their footsteps tapping lightly on the tile floor, their quiet conversations adding to the background hum. But for Ava, the usual comfort of these sounds only made her feel more isolated. She was used to controlling the flow of the store, used to directing her co-workers, and making sure things ran smoothly. Now everything seemed distant, disconnected. Even the mundane noises of the store couldn't distract her from the panic building in her chest. Mr. Coleman's presence loomed large in front of her, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the rising turmoil inside her. She wanted to scream at him, to shout that this wasn't fair, that she had earned her place here. But something about the way he looked at her, so composed and unbothered, kept her silent. Ava could feel her control slipping away bit by bit. The certainty she had clung to for so long was unraveling. She felt like she was floating above herself, watching as everything she had built was slowly being dismantled. And then, from somewhere in the store, a soft clattering sound echoed through the air. A display shelf near the back wobbled slightly, as if something had knocked into it. Ava's heart jumped in her chest, her instincts pulling her toward the sound. Normally, she would have rushed over, fixed whatever was out of place, and kept things running smoothly. But now, she felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot in front of Mr. Coleman. She glanced at Henry, hoping he would take charge, but he simply watched her, his arms still crossed, his expression neutral. He wasn't going to step in. He wasn't going to fix this for her. The clattering sound faded, replaced by the soft murmur of customers browsing. It was a small thing, something she normally wouldn't have given a second thought. But now, it felt like one more piece of the store slipping out of her grasp. The tension in the air was suffocating. Ava could feel her pulse quickening, her breath becoming shallow. Her entire career was flashing before her eyes, and she didn't know how to stop it. Mr. Coleman stood there, watching her with that same infuriating calmness, waiting for her to make the next move. But what could she say? What could she do to fix this? Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She needed to regain control, to reassert herself, to fight back. "Look," Ava said, her voice sharp now, the desperation leaking through. "I've been here longer than anyone. I know how this store works. I know the customers. I know how to keep things running smoothly. You can't just waltz in here and change everything." Her voice rose as she spoke, each word more defensive than the last. She was on the edge now, teetering between anger and fear, and she could feel the words spilling out of her before she could stop them. "This store has standards," she continued, her voice almost shaking. "We cater to a certain kind of customer. That's how we've always done things, and that's why the store has been successful. You don't just throw that away because of some idea of what you think is right." Mr. Coleman's expression didn't change. He didn't react to her outburst, didn't even blink. He simply stood there waiting for her to finish. Ava felt the air leave her lungs in a rush. She had said everything she could think of, but none of it had made a dent. Mr. Coleman wasn't going to be swayed by her arguments, wasn't going to back down. She had thrown everything at him, and it hadn't worked. Ava's breath hitched as the finality of her own words hung in the air. The store, the customers, the reputation. It had all felt so secure, so permanent, until now. But Mr. Coleman didn't react. He remained calm, composed, and unmoved, as if her outburst had simply confirmed everything he already knew. His silence stretched, growing heavier by the second, and Ava's heart raced as she realized she had no idea how to undo the damage she had just done. "I think you're missing the point," Mr. Coleman said quietly, but with the same firmness that had carried through every word since he revealed who he was. "It's not about throwing anything away. It's about building something better, more inclusive." The word inclusive cut through Ava like a blade. It wasn't just about him. This was bigger than one interaction, bigger than the man standing in front of her. This was about the direction the entire store was moving in, and that direction didn't include her old ways of thinking. Her stomach churned as the weight of that realization sank in. Everything she'd taken pride in, everything she thought made her valuable to the store, was suddenly irrelevant. All the years of judging customers by appearance, by their clothes, or the way they walked, it had all been for nothing. The rules had changed, and she hadn't noticed until it was too late. "You've been here a long time, Ava," Mr. Coleman continued, "but times change. The customers change. And this store needs to change with them." Ava could feel the words like a death sentence. She wanted to argue, wanted to fight back, but she could sense that the battle was already lost. This wasn't just about one incident, one customer she'd mistreated. This was about an entire approach to business that no longer had a place in Mr. Coleman's vision for the store. Her chest tightened with the weight of that truth. It wasn't just her job that was at stake. It was everything she had built her identity around. And now, in one swift motion, it was all being taken from her. I didn't know things were changing," Ava stammered, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "I thought I was doing what was right. For the store." "You thought you were doing what was best for your idea of the store," Mr. Coleman corrected, his tone still firm, but not unkind. "But that's not what's best for the customers, or for the business. Not anymore." The reality of his words struck Ava like a punch to the gut. She had always believed that her judgment, her instincts, were what kept the store successful. But in truth, she had been clinging to a version of the store that was slowly disappearing, replaced by something new, something she didn't understand. A deep, unsettling panic settled over her. If she couldn't adapt, if she couldn't change, then where did that leave her? For years, she had been at the top of the store's hierarchy, the one who knew how everything worked. But now, she was slipping, falling behind in a world that was moving faster than she had ever anticipated. "Things are changing," Mr. Coleman repeated, his voice softer now. "And if you want to be a part of this store's future, you're going to have to change too." Ava's mouth went dry. The message was clear: adapt or be left behind. And she wasn't sure if she could adapt. Henry, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, finally stepped forward, his expression still neutral, but with a slight edge of finality in his voice. Ava knew him well enough to recognize that look, the one that said a decision had been made. "Mr. Coleman is right," Henry said, his tone even but firm. "We've been discussing these changes for a while now. We need to make sure the store is welcoming to everyone. That means we need to take a different approach with how we treat customers." Ava's heart sank. Henry had known about this all along. While she had been stuck in her ways, believing she was the backbone of the store, Henry had been preparing for a future that didn't include her methods. He had stood by and watched as she dug herself deeper into her rigid, outdated mindset, and now it was clear that he wasn't going to stop the inevitable. "You've always been a strong employee, Ava," Henry continued, his voice lacking any real warmth. "But this store can't stay the way it's been. We need to be better. And if you can't get on board with that—" He paused, letting the unspoken words hang in the air. Ava's chest tightened. There it was, the ultimatum she had been dreading. She could either fall in line, reshape herself into someone she barely recognized, or she could leave. After all the years of loyalty, the long hours, the countless customers she had handled, it had come down to this: change or be pushed out. Ava struggled to find her voice. Her thoughts were a tangled mess of resentment and fear. "I didn't realize that everything was going to change so fast." Henry gave a small, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. It's been changing for a while now, Ava. You just didn't see it. That final remark cut deeper than anything else. Ava had been blind to the shift happening right under her nose. She'd been so certain, so sure of her place in the store, that she hadn't noticed the world moving on without her. Henry glanced at Mr. Coleman, who nodded slightly, a signal that the conversation was over. The decision had been made. Ava's future was now entirely dependent on whether or not she could adapt to this new world, and she wasn't sure if she had the strength to do it. Mr. Coleman turned back to Ava, his expression no longer neutral, but resolute. "We're giving you a choice, Ava," he said. "You can take some time to think about how you want to move forward. If you're willing to adapt, to change the way you approach your work, then we're willing to work with you. But if you can't, then—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. Ava was replaceable. The store would move on without her if it needed to. For the first time, she truly felt the weight of that realization pressing down on her. "I understand," Ava said quietly, though she didn't really. Her mind was still spinning, still trying to process the fact that everything she had built was crumbling beneath her. Mr. Coleman nodded. "Take a day or two to think about it. But remember, this store is moving forward. We need everyone on board." With that, Mr. Coleman and Henry exchanged one last glance before walking away, leaving Ava standing alone in the middle of the store she had once ruled so confidently. Her kingdom, her control, her sense of superiority, it had all been stripped away in a matter of minutes, leaving her with nothing but the uncertainty of what came next. As the door to the office clicked shut behind them, Ava felt the full weight of her isolation settle over her. The store continued to hum quietly around her, the soft buzz of customers browsing and the muted conversations between her co-workers. But to Ava, it all felt distant, like she was watching from the outside, no longer a part of the world she'd known so intimately. For years, she had been the one in control, the one calling the shots. Now she was just another employee, facing the very real possibility of being left behind in a world that was changing faster than she could keep up. And for the first time in her career, Ava felt truly powerless. Ava stood motionless for what felt like hours, though only minutes passed. The store seemed to buzz around her, a stark contrast to the suffocating stillness inside her chest. Everything she thought she knew, every rule she had built her career upon, had crumbled in front of her, and now she had to face the bleak reality: adapt or disappear. Her mind raced, replaying Mr. Coleman's words over and over. Take a day or two to think about it. She wasn't sure there was anything to think about. How could she change who she was, how she saw the world, overnight? She had spent years honing her instincts, trusting her judgment, and now, in a single conversation, everything had been flipped upside down. The store, once a place where she felt in control, now felt foreign to her. The gentle murmur of customers browsing, the soft sounds of shoes against the polished floor, even the quiet chime of the front door as new customers entered. Everything that had once been familiar and reassuring now felt distant, as if she were no longer a part of it. Ava's hands trembled slightly, her breath shallow and uneven. Her entire career was at stake, and the worst part was, she didn't know if she had the strength or the will to save it. The realization made her sick to her stomach. She had always been proud, confident in her role, but now she felt small, insignificant, replaceable, and worse, powerless. The minutes ticked by, each one filled with a growing sense of dread. How was she supposed to adapt? The very idea felt impossible. She had always prided herself on her ability to read people, to know who belonged and who didn't. It had become second nature to her. How could she just unlearn that? Her pulse quickened again as the weight of her own helplessness settled in. This wasn't just about changing her behavior at work. This was about questioning everything she thought she knew. And the more she thought about it, the more overwhelming it became. Ava felt the walls of the store closing in on her, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The room seemed to tilt, and for a moment, she thought she might faint. She forced herself to take a deep breath, trying to steady the rising panic in her chest. She glanced toward the back office where Mr. Coleman and Henry had disappeared, hoping for some kind of reprieve, some chance to plead her case again. But the door remained closed, and Ava knew that whatever decision she made, she was on her own. Just as she was about to resign herself to the suffocating pressure, she saw a familiar face walk through the door. Rachel, a longtime customer and one of Ava's favorites. Rachel was everything Ava thought a good customer should be. Well-dressed, polite, with the kind of refined taste that Ava respected. She felt a brief flicker of hope. Maybe if she handled this interaction perfectly, if she showed Mr. Coleman and Henry that she could still manage the floor with her usual expertise, it would prove that she was still valuable. Rachel approached the counter, smiling warmly as she glanced over the displays. "Ava, it's good to see you. I'm looking for a gift for my husband. He's been eyeing those new watches you've got in stock. Do you have time to help me out?" Ava seized the opportunity, forcing a smile onto her face. "Of course, Rachel. I'd be happy to help." For a moment, it felt like old times. Ava guided Rachel over to the watch display, pulling out the sleek, high-end timepieces with the practiced precision she had mastered over the years. Rachel's easy conversation and clear appreciation for the store's offerings brought Ava some comfort. This was familiar. This was her domain. As they discussed the different watches, Ava's nerves began to calm. Maybe she had overreacted earlier. Maybe if she just focused on doing her job, handling the right customers, making sure the store ran smoothly, everything would settle down. Mr. Coleman couldn't possibly want to get rid of her if she kept things running efficiently. Rachel finally settled on a watch, and Ava wrapped it with care, her hands steady for the first time in what felt like hours. As she handed the box to Rachel, she felt a small surge of confidence. She still knew how to do this job. She still had the skills that made her valuable. Rachel smiled as she took the package. "Thanks so much, Ava. You always know exactly what I need." Ava's chest swelled with a mixture of pride and relief. "Anytime, Rachel. You know I'm always here for you." As Rachel left, Ava allowed herself a moment to breathe. Maybe things weren't as bad as they seemed. She still had loyal customers, people who appreciated her expertise. If she could just keep doing what she did best, maybe everything would work out. She straightened up, smoothing the front of her blazer. Yes, she could adapt. She could change, just enough to keep her place in the store. The thought brought her some comfort, though it was tinged with an underlying uncertainty she couldn't quite shake. Ava's brief moment of relief was shattered almost immediately. As she turned to attend to another customer, she heard the familiar chime of the front door, followed by a group of people entering the store. At first, she didn't pay much attention. New customers came in all the time, but when she glanced up, her heart sank. A man, tall and muscular, dressed in baggy jeans and a loose hoodie, walked in with two younger companions, teenagers by the look of them. They moved confidently, maybe a little too confidently, their heads swiveling around as they took in the luxury goods on display. One of the boys laughed, pointing at a row of expensive sneakers in the window display, and the other nudged him, whispering something under his breath. Ava's stomach twisted. She could feel the familiar irritation rise up, the sense that these were not the kind of customers who belonged here. She knew what this meant. Teenagers like these usually didn't buy anything. They just came in, messed around, wasted time, and left. Sometimes they even stole things. She had seen it happen before. Her pulse quickened as they wandered deeper into the store, the older man leading the way. He looked vaguely familiar, like he'd been in the store before, but Ava couldn't place him. Regardless, she knew what kind of customer he was. She had to handle this before it got out of hand. Without hesitation, Ava stepped out from behind the counter, her posture rigid, her voice clipped as she addressed the man. "Can I help you with something?" The man glanced over at her, his expression unreadable. He paused for a moment, then smiled, a slow, measured smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just looking around," he said, his voice casual, but there was an edge to it that made Ava's nerves spike. "We don't allow loitering," Ava said, the words slipping out before she could stop herself. It was an automatic response, one she had used countless times before. But as soon as the words left her mouth, she realized her mistake. The man's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. One of the teenagers stopped mid-laugh, the other tensing beside him. Ava felt the air between them shift, a tension thickening in the space. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't back down now. "We're not loitering," the man said, his voice dropping slightly, the smile completely gone from his face. "We're customers." Ava swallowed hard, her pulse racing. She had been in situations like this before, ones that could go south quickly if she wasn't careful. But this time, the stakes were higher. Mr. Coleman was in the back, and every move she made now could determine her future. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Still, her instincts told her to push back. "If you're not planning to buy something, I'll have to ask you to leave," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. The man's eyes darkened, his posture shifting as he squared his shoulders. The teenagers exchanged a look, but neither of them moved. Ava's heart pounded in her ears as she realized she was on the edge of losing control. Again. Ava's breath quickened as the man's expression darkened. His eyes were locked onto hers now, and she could feel the weight of his stare. The energy in the store shifted, and the tension that hung in the air was thick enough to cut. The two teenagers behind him stood perfectly still, their postures tense as if waiting for his lead. For a brief second, Ava thought about backing down, softening her approach. But the words were already out. There was no going back. She had issued a challenge, and now she had to stand by it, whether she liked it or not. The man took a slow step toward her, his face inches from hers now. "You think I'm here to cause trouble, don't you?" he asked, his voice low and steady but with a sharp edge. "You see me walk in here, and you automatically assume I don't belong." Ava's throat tightened. His words stung because they were true, and for the first time she realized how visible her biases had become. This wasn't a subtle exchange anymore. She had been caught out, and the man in front of her knew exactly what she had been thinking the moment he walked through the door. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he continued, his tone even more dangerous in its calmness. "I'm here to shop just like everyone else." Ava's mind raced, searching for a way to diffuse the situation. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Her confidence, her control, it was slipping through her fingers like sand. She wanted to hold on to the glimmer of hope that had emerged earlier with Rachel, but it was fading fast, leaving her with nothing but uncertainty and fear. Ava began, but the man cut her off. "You think you know people just by looking at them, don't you?" he said, his voice rising just enough to draw the attention of the other customers in the store. "You think you know who belongs and who doesn't." Ava's cheeks burned with shame, her heart pounding in her chest. The accusation hit her squarely in the gut, and she knew she couldn't deny it. That was exactly what she had done, what she had been doing for years, and now it was all crashing down around her. "I'm sorry," Ava said, her voice barely audible, the words foreign and unfamiliar on her tongue. She wasn't used to apologizing. She wasn't used to being wrong. But now there was no other option. The man stared at her for a long moment, his expression still hard, but something shifted in his eyes. He straightened up slightly, his body no longer looming over her. "You don't know anything about me," he said quietly, his tone less confrontational now. "And you don't get to decide who belongs here." Ava swallowed hard, her throat dry. She nodded, unable to find the words to respond. The man glanced at the two teenagers behind him and gave a slight nod. They both relaxed, the tension in their bodies easing as they turned to follow him toward the exit. Before leaving, the man turned back to Ava one last time. "Next time, maybe you'll think twice before judging someone based on what they look like." With that, he pushed open the door, and the chime echoed through the store as they left. Ava stood frozen in place, the store suddenly too quiet around her. Her mind swirled with a mixture of shame, regret, and a creeping sense of dread. She had lost control, not just of the situation, but of everything she thought she knew about her job. Her instincts had failed her, and now she was left standing in the wreckage of her own choices. Ava's breath was shallow, her hands trembling as she tried to collect herself. She felt as though the floor beneath her was unstable, shifting with each second that passed. She hadn't just lost her temper, she had lost her footing entirely. The confrontation with the man lingered in the air, and she couldn't escape the reality of what had just happened. The back office door creaked open, and Henry stepped out, his face grim. Ava's heart sank. She didn't need to hear what he was going to say. She already knew. "We need to talk, Ava," Henry said, his voice low but firm. "Now." Ava's legs felt weak as she followed him toward the back office. With each step, the weight of her failure grew heavier. The hope she had felt earlier, that brief glimmer of possibility, was gone. Now there was only dread, cold and unrelenting, settling into her bones. As soon as they were inside the office, Henry closed the door behind them. He didn't waste any time. "Mr. Coleman heard everything," Henry said, his tone clipped. "You know that, don't you?" Ava's heart raced. Of course he had. The entire store had probably heard the confrontation. There was no escaping it now. She nodded slowly, her throat too tight to speak. Henry's face was a mask of disappointment, and it stung worse than any words he could have said. Ava, we gave you a chance. Mr. Coleman gave you a chance to adapt, to change. But after today, he trailed off, shaking his head. This isn't going to work. Ava felt the world tilt again, her stomach dropping as the full weight of his words hit her. This wasn't just a reprimand. This wasn't a warning. This was the end. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built in her career was slipping away, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I can change, Ava said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the desperation in her tone was clear. I can— No, Ava, Henry interrupted, his voice hard. It's too late for that. Ava felt like the room was closing in on her, the walls pressing tighter with every breath she took. Her mind raced, searching for something, anything to say that could change his mind. But nothing came. There were no more excuses, no more justifications. She had run out of options. We're going to have to let you go, Henry said, his words final. Mr. Coleman has already made the decision. Ava's world shattered. The room blurred around her as the reality of the situation hit her like a tidal wave. Fired. After all these years, after everything she had done for the store, she was being let go. Her chest tightened, the weight of the words suffocating her. Please, Henry, she said, her voice trembling. Don't do this. I can fix it. I can— Henry shook his head. It's done, Ava. I'm sorry. The silence in the room was deafening, the finality of the moment sinking into Ava's skin like ice. There was no more hope, no more control. Everything she had feared, everything she had tried to hold on to, was gone. She was being left behind. Ava sat in the back office, numb. Henry had left her alone after delivering the final blow, and now the walls seemed to press in on her from all sides. The silence was suffocating. For so long she had been at the center of this store, guiding its operations, managing the customers, and controlling her domain with an iron grip. And now she had nothing. Her mind replayed the confrontation with the man, the look in his eyes when he called her out, the finality of Mr. Coleman's words when he had given her a chance to change. She had let her pride blind her, and now it was too late. The sinking realization settled deeper into her bones with each passing second. Outside the office, she could hear the faint murmur of customers and employees moving through the store. Life went on, even as hers crumbled. Her position, her authority, everything had been stripped away, leaving her with the bitter taste of failure. Ava had always thought that her years of service, her experience, and her knowledge of the store made her irreplaceable. She had believed that the way she handled things was the only way they could be handled. But now, with her entire career hanging by a thread, she realized how wrong she had been. She wasn't indispensable. She wasn't even necessary. And worst of all, she had brought this on herself. The finality of that thought struck Ava like a blow to the chest. All the customers she had judged, the colleagues she had dismissed, the assumptions she had made about who belonged and who didn't. It all came rushing back to her in a painful wave of clarity. She had been so sure of her place in the store, so certain that she was above reproach, but now she saw it for what it was. Arrogance, plain and simple. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared down at them. What was she supposed to do now? She had nowhere to go, no fallback plan. This job had been her life for so long that she couldn't imagine anything else, and now it was being ripped away from her. Ava closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not in the office that had once been her fortress. But it was hard to hold back the flood of emotions that swirled inside her. Anger, regret, shame. How had it all come to this? Scene 2. Escape. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, Ava forced herself to stand. Her legs felt weak, like they might give out beneath her, but she steeled herself. She couldn't stay here any longer. The weight of the store's operations, of the decisions that now rested in Mr. Coleman's hands, no longer included her. She was no longer part of this place, and she had to accept that. With shaky hands, Ava gathered her belongings from the small desk she had once called her own. The office felt foreign now, like it belonged to someone else, someone who hadn't just watched her entire world collapse. She stuffed a few personal items, a framed photo of her and her colleagues, her favorite pen, a notebook, into her bag. The rest of it, the things that belonged to the store, she left behind. Her movements were mechanical, each action feeling distant, as though someone else were controlling her body. Ava barely registered what she was doing as she walked to the door and reached for the handle. But just before she could turn the knob, she hesitated. For a brief moment she considered marching back out onto the floor, confronting Mr. Coleman and Henry one last time. She wanted to scream, to argue, to make them see how much she had given to this place. But she knew it wouldn't make a difference. They had already made their decision, and nothing she said or did now would change that. She was done. Ava exhaled slowly, letting the breath shake her chest as it left her body. Then, without looking back, she opened the door and stepped into the store one final time. The floor felt different beneath her feet. The familiar buzz of activity, the quiet conversation of customers, the soft beeps of the register, the rustle of shopping bags, felt distant, as if the store had already moved on without her. And maybe it had. Ava walked past the rows of neatly arranged products, her gaze downcast, avoiding the eyes of the employees who watched her go. She reached the front of the store, her hand resting on the door handle. For a moment she paused, looking back over her shoulder. This had been her life for so long, her identity, her purpose. Now it was all slipping away, and she wasn't sure what would come next. But then she pushed the door open, and the chime rang one last time as she stepped out into the street. The cool air hit Ava's face as she stepped onto the sidewalk, and for a moment, she just stood there, staring blankly ahead. The city buzzed with life around her, people hurrying past, cars honking in the distance. Everything felt surreal, as though she were watching the world from behind a thick sheet of glass. She didn't know where to go, what to do next. For the first time in years, she was completely untethered, unmoored from the routine and structure that had defined her life. The store had been everything to her, and now it was gone. Ava's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as she walked aimlessly down the street, her thoughts swirling. Her mind kept drifting back to Mr. Coleman's words. If you want to be part of the store's future, you need to change. But change had never come easily to Ava. She had always been set in her ways, sure of her judgment, convinced that she knew better than anyone else. And now, that certainty had cost her everything. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. Ava fished it out and glanced at the screen. A text from a colleague, probably checking to see if she was okay. She ignored it, stuffing the phone back into her bag. She wasn't ready to talk to anyone yet. As she walked, Ava's mind wandered back over the past few years. She thought about the customers she had dismissed, the colleagues she had looked down on, the judgments she had made without a second thought. She had always believed she was doing what was best for the store, but now she saw the truth. She had been protecting her own ego, her own sense of superiority. She had been wrong. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, she had to stop walking, leaning against a nearby building to catch her breath. She had spent so long building up walls, protecting herself from any vulnerability, that she hadn't seen how isolated she had become. Now, those walls were crumbling, leaving her exposed and raw. Ava blinked back the tears that stung her eyes. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know if she could change, if she could adapt to the new world that Mr. Coleman had brought into the store. But what she did know was that she couldn't keep going the way she had been. Something had to give. Ava stood for a long moment, leaning against the cold brick wall of the building, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. She watched people pass by, their faces a blur of indifference, while she felt like she was sinking deeper into the weight of her own failures. She had thought her world was ending, but as she stared out into the city, something strange began to happen. The more she watched the people around her, strangers walking briskly to their destinations, laughing on their phones, carrying on with their lives, the more a flicker of clarity began to form in her mind. Life was moving forward. It wasn't stopping because she had lost her job. The world didn't grind to a halt because she had failed. For the first time in hours, Ava's chest loosened. The weight of the store, her position, her identity as the senior associate, began to lift. In the grand scheme of things, it was just a job, just a place she had worked. It wasn't her whole life. It didn't have to define her. She had thought that losing the job meant losing everything, but maybe it didn't have to be that way. Maybe there was more to her than the role she had played for so many years. Ava blinked, the sudden realization making her heart race for an entirely different reason. For so long, she had tied her sense of self-worth to her job, to her ability to control the store floor, to her judgment of others. But now, standing here, feeling the cool autumn breeze against her skin, she realized she could let it go. She could start over. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be immediate, but it was possible. The store wasn't her only source of value. For the first time, Ava wondered what she might be capable of outside the narrow role she had confined herself to. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. A small, bitter smile tugged at her lips. Losing the job had felt like a disaster, but now she understood that it was also an opportunity, a chance to redefine herself, to become someone who wasn't trapped by old ways of thinking. Maybe this was what Mr. Coleman had been trying to tell her all along. As the realization settled over her, Ava felt something inside her shift. It wasn't a sudden epiphany that made everything better, but it was a beginning, a seed of hope that hadn't been there before. She stood up straighter, pulling her bag more securely onto her shoulder. The streets around her were still bustling with life, and now she could see it for what it was, opportunity. There were endless possibilities out there, and for the first time, Ava was open to them. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket. This time she pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text from a former colleague, asking if she was okay. Ava stared at it for a moment, then tapped a quick reply. "I'm fine. I'll be in touch soon." She wasn't ready to talk about what had happened just yet, but she wasn't hiding from it either. She would face it when she was ready. Ava took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs in a way that felt freeing. She wasn't trapped anymore. She was stepping into the unknown, but that didn't have to be a bad thing. She had spent so long clinging to control, to certainty. But now she realized that letting go didn't mean falling apart. It meant opening herself up to something new. As she began to walk again, Ava found herself heading toward the park. She hadn't been there in months, too busy, too wrapped up in work. But now the idea of sitting by the water, of just existing without the weight of the store hanging over her, sounded like exactly what she needed. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to rush, to be anywhere, to prove anything. She could just be. As she crossed the street and entered the park, Ava felt a strange sense of lightness settle over her. The trees were shedding their leaves, the wind carrying them through the air in golden waves. Ava walked along the path, her footsteps slow and deliberate, until she reached the edge of the small lake that sat at the center of the park. She sat on a bench, her gaze sweeping over the water as it rippled gently in the breeze. The chaos of the day seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the quiet hum of nature. Ava watched as a few ducks drifted lazily across the water, their movements slow and peaceful. For the first time in years, Ava allowed herself to breathe, really breathe. As she sat there, her thoughts turned back to the store, to Mr. Coleman's calm, unbothered demeanor. She had hated him in the moment, but now she realized that he hadn't been trying to punish her. He had been trying to open her eyes, and maybe he had. Ava smiled to herself, a real smile this time, as the punchline of her own life became clear. She had been so obsessed with control, with keeping the right customers happy, with maintaining the status quo, that she hadn't noticed the world moving on without her. In the end, the thing she had feared the most, losing control, had been exactly what she needed. She laughed softly, shaking her head at the irony of it all. Sometimes you had to lose everything to see what really mattered. And for Ava, what mattered now was moving forward, even if she didn't know exactly where that path would lead. For the first time, she was okay with that. As she sat there, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, Ava felt a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew she would face it head-on, without fear, without judgment. Because in the end, losing control had given her the freedom to truly live.